Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War One TV. If you didn't see the earlier show on World War Two TV, we were talking about Arnhem veterans and the photos taken by a fantastic guest called Keith Coleman. But this, we're going back a generation to talk about the First World War. And the lions led by donkeys trope has been around for decades, but we've not discussed it here on this channel. So Louise Provan is going to moderate the discussion with three fabulous historians. I'll bring Louise in, and then Louise can introduce our guests. So good evening, Louise. How are you today?
Good, thanks, Woody. Yourself? How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. So who have we got?
Well, tonight we have Jonny Dyer, who is he's an MA in Great Britain in the First World War for the University of Wolverhampton. As we said before, all roads lead to Wolverhampton. And he is currently studying for a PhD there in the performance of the 6 BF divisions in 1917-1918. We also have, and I'm going to have to get this right, Dr. Andrew Locke. Now, who is not yet?
Not yet. Really close. Really close.
Yeah, very close. In the tactical progress in the Army's infantry in the wake of the Somme and the pursuit of the Hindenburg Line in early 1917. And he teaches history at University of Suffolk, as well as being a trustee of the Great War Group. And finally, we have Dr. Bart Ziino, who's a senior lecturer in history at Deakin University of Melbourne, and he is logging in from Australia, so it is horrible o'clock for him at the moment.
So a round of applause for everybody for Bart getting up so stupidly early just to talk about war stuff. So a virtual round of applause, sir.
Above and beyond the Call of Duty. That Bart has a couple of publications: A Distant Grief, Australian War Graves and the Great War, and he's contributed to the recently published Routledge History of the First World War. And I'll put links to publications that we mention in the chat after the show.
Great.
Okay.
That's our guest. So, Louise, I'm going to sit in the background. I'm going to just go gather the questions from the viewers. Viewers, as you know, with a panel discussion, it's possible we won't get to everybody's questions, or you may be asking the same things, but I will kind of store a few of them to go on. And Louise is going to take us around this topic. And so I'm going to just sit in the back and twiddle my thumbs. So, Louise, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks everyone for joining tonight. It should be a very interesting discussion. I don't think any other conflict has been subject to such sort of enduring perceptions and ideas about what it was about. And at this stage, I won't call them myths, because we're going to look at these perceptions and perhaps misconceptions and to discover whether there is any truth to them, or are they just zombie myths that won't die? But they are firmly ingrained in cultural memory. And I don't think any other conflict in history evokes such strong emotions, and in some ways it seems that the First World War has been removed from academic study and is looked at in a purely emotional basis and provokes emotional reaction. For the public are very interested in new historical discoveries. There's plenty of TV shows, but if you challenge them about these perceptions, they do take badly to them. Anything about the First World War. So Gary Sheffield had talked about hate mail he received after a TV appearance challenging the lions led by donkeys myth. So I hope everyone here is prepared for the digital equivalent of hate mail, which is the letter written green ink and capital letters. So yeah. So with that, I think we'll just go straight to the first myth or idea, and it is lions led by donkeys. Where did this come from? Is it true? And has it been debunked? Who wants to kick off? Jonny.
Lions led by donkeys. The origin of the phrase doesn't actually come from the First World War. It existed long before that. In the context of the Great War, it comes from Alan Clark's book, The Donkeys, which he wrote in 1961. Alan Clark, I mean, he's well known in other circles for being a bit of a ladies' man. There's all sorts of wonderful stuff you can read about him. As a historian, he writes a powerful polemic. Michael Howard actually described the book as entertainment, not history, which I think is probably about right. He focuses on a relatively narrow part of the war in terms of 1915, which is frankly a lousy year for the British Expeditionary Force. It's not a good year for the Allies per se. For me, I think it's quite interesting in the sense that it's a slogan, and it's probably a good slogan if you're trying to create that narrative. I'll leave it to someone else to actually sort of talk about what he did with the slogan and where he went with it. But it comes into the whole narrative of looking at, sort of, if we bring it up to a sort of slightly more modern, albeit it's nearly 30 years ago, Blackadder goes forth. The image of Geoffrey Palmer as Douglas Haig as sweeping toy soldiers off a board into a bin. Again, it's a very powerful image. It's certainly an awful lot funnier and probably better in terms of cultural perceptions than Douglas Haig sitting at his desk thinking about establishing a training directorate, which is probably nearer the truth. Yeah, that's the origins of the phrases. So I'll ping it back over to you for further.
Yeah, it seemed to, when after the First World War, obviously it was a victory. Haig was the hero, and then the dissatisfaction seemed to kick in a bit later. And I'm wondering if that was the same in Australia, Bart.
Yeah, I think this myth. I mean, it's important that the book comes out in the 60s. It's it's nearly 50 years after the war, so the context is quite important here. You've got a Britain that's decolonizing and it's seeing the war in new ways. In Australia, this idea has some utility. Again, context matters. It's an Australian who writes the book British Butchers and Bunglers of World War I, but this book comes out in the 1980s. And I think even here that sort of narrative has some is regarded with some disdain. But we have to understand that these stories circulate with a purpose. All myths have a purpose. This one works in Australia because it suggests that Australians knew better. It suggests that Australians had some superiority to British units, that British generals had sacrificed Australian soldiers. But all of that hadn't been particularly well pronounced until the era of new nationalism in Australia in the 1970s. So I think Lions Led by Donkeys, it's been a particularly strong British narrative, but it's found some utility amongst Australians who want to see it as a moment of national awakening that includes a rejection of Britain. But that certainly wasn't true at the time of the war, and it certainly wasn't true in the 1920s and 30s. So, sort of make an appeal for understanding this, even though the phrase is so long-lived. We really have to understand its potency in terms of when books like The Donkeys came out in the 60s. It's got a much greater punch at that time than it did earlier, I would suggest.
Yeah, it seemed like there was this sudden mind shift. It started in the 30s. Andy, would you agree with that the actual change with it came from, it was a successful war we won to, through Basil Little whatever his name was,
Little Hart.
Yeah, it started to change there.
Well, it also kind of, when Douglas Haig dies, a fairly young and exhausted man, not that long after the Great War, then kind of open season can take place on him particularly, because if there's someone to wear the blame, then the Commander-in-Chief will often get it. I think it's quite interesting how he wears the blame for things and takes little credit for victories as well, which hopefully we'll get into as this show goes on. I think the context, as Bart said, is really important for the 60s, because you've got that sort of failure for living standards to come up, and the better world that people were fighting for in the First World War doesn't quite happen. And then the other kind of, well, not quite truth. The war to end all wars is proven colossally to be false by the Second World War, and then the idea that you fight for God, King, and Empire, and again, as Bart said, that decolonization process gets going, and empire becomes a bad thing to have fought for, and then the idea that the soldiers were conned into fighting, and it was never worth fighting for in the first place, really kind of loses track of where Britain was in 1914 and the decision for war in the first place. So the context of the time of these publications is really important. I actually think John Laffin's book, Butchers and Bunglers, is almost like kind of where things start tipping in that sense. And actually, people start to think, hang on a minute, this is a little too far. And then that's kind of when the revisionist school kind of gets going, the sort of late 1980s and into the 1990s. And I think it's now worth drawing distinction that the kind of scholarly circles around the First World War, whether it's the Wolverhampton Mafia or wherever it may be, of which I am part, yeah, of course, but I think we've gone into almost like a golden age of scholarship on the Great War, actually, because, as you rightly say, Louise, it's very emotional, and it was particularly when veterans were still alive. And now, with some years kind of after that, we've got a little bit of detachment. We also had a bit of interest with the centenary coming in. So actually, kind of scholarly work on the Great War, I don't think has ever been better than it is now. The proliferation of digitized sources, as well as making stuff available that hasn't been kind of to the extent that it has been before. And so the work going on right now is brilliant. However, filtering that into the general public is such a challenge, and it's because some of these classic old ideas just don't seem to get in the box. Really. And I actually don't think kind of public figures help very much with this. I think certain stuff is easy and it gets the kind of social media thumbs ups a lot of the time, and so it's very, very hard for us to try and kick against.
I
Whereabouts
wanted to jump in,
oh,
but
sorry.
just to jump in quickly, Lions Led by Donkeys fulfills all the YouTube requirements for a really good line. You know, when I'm putting a show up, you do how it gets scored in terms of it hits all the right boxes, it ticks all the right boxes. So, you know, as it's got a really good zinginess to it, which doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it means anything. But I'm just saying, from pure YouTube point of view, it's a really good tagline.
It's yeah, it's an interesting argument in that I was looking at, you know, say John Terrain, who disagreed with Lion Joseph Donkeys and the size of the book there, his Haig's own diaries, letters, the size of that book. Whereas if you compare with Lions Led by Donkeys, it's basically a little pamphlet. That's as much as a lot of people can attention span. So you're right, yeah, as a tagline, it works. I also think, is it a case that Lions Led by Donkeys, it was more caused by disillusionment with the peace rather than disillusionment with the war itself? If that makes sense. Yep.
Yes, it's certainly. I mean, the 1930s, a really important time for the development of that narrative. If you think of the great sort of war books boom that follows, well, you know, it's coincident with Haig's death, I guess, and only coincident. But of course, you know, it's in the late 20s that we get those books like All Quiet on the Western Front, or Her Private's We, or Undertones of War. All those books that emerged with the narrative that this had been an exercise in futility, that the soldiers had been victims. And of course, when you claim that someone's a victim, that implies that somebody is the persecutor or the guilty party. And that narrative is really held strong, but it wasn't necessarily there as powerfully as it was from the late 20s and into the 30s. It wasn't as powerful during the war, even though we can point to your Wilfred Owens and so forth. So, you know, your point's a fair one, that there is a narrative of disillusionment that allows something like the Lions Led by Donkeys line, which works so well now we know, to really hook in and take off from there. It's got fertile ground, but it is rooted in time.
So I think maybe now's a good time to move on to who could be head donkey, if you like, Haig. This is Butcher Haig, the demolition of his reputation post-war, public perception, and I would say it was helped along somewhat in the 1980s by Blackadder. Jonny, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of those things that's important to remember. I don't have it for the slides, but there's a great picture of Trafalgar Square and the surrounding area that Alex Churchill showed me of Haig and his generals coming back, I think in sort of early 1919, and the crowds are quite extraordinary. So it was a hero's welcome. I think as societies kind of move away from war, as is inevitable after one, then the questions start being asked. And as Andy said, someone ends up carrying the can, whether they deserve it or not. The debate is hugely driven by the literature. David Lloyd George's memoirs, I think, are probably key in this.
I actually have a slide here. I don't know if Woody can put the slides up. I actually have a slide here. Yeah, I don't know if everyone can see, but that is David Lloyd George's index to his stuff about Haig, and it is not a futility of Passchendaele, fails to appreciate value of tanks. It's just an absolute demolition job on Haig.
And I think there's 2.5 pages of index, which is represents this failure to do that and so on. It's just the most extraordinary hatchet job. I mean, I think I've not read all 3,500 pages of it. From memory, I think he's reasonably light on sources. But yeah, that very much drives the debate. I think Churchill weighs in as well. And as Andy said, Haig is dead at this point. He has no ability to defend himself, and it kind of snowballs from there. It's just one of those things. I read a thesis recently, and one of the opening lines was, why is it almost impossible to get kind of a decent appraisal of Haig? And I think Gary Sheffield sums it up. He says it's casualties, and you simply cannot say. It's very, very difficult to separate the two. It's kind of saying, Mrs. Kennedy, other than that, the drive around Dallas was great, wasn't it? It's really, really difficult to separate them. We can go on to his record and so on, but even the revisionists like Gary Sheffield, they're not saying he's perfect. They know that he makes mistakes, and that's unquestionable. We could talk about those. So yeah, it's a very powerful narrative, and I think it's just one of those things in history. If you are, but I think this is probably the most prevalent. If you are the man with that butcher's bill around your neck, whether you like it or not, it's going to be very, very difficult to shift it. And it doesn't matter, we could all sit and debate it tonight, and I hope we come up with some great opinions on it. It's guaranteed. If Lockie puts out a 14-point tweet tomorrow on Haig, revisionism and everything else, you can fairly much guarantee within 10 minutes someone will reply butcher, and almost guarantee again that 3 times as many likes as the original post will hit that. I think it's just the nature of it.
But Lockie, if Haig is to blame for things like Passchendaele and the Somme, and undoubtedly had his flaws, he was overly optimistic about various plans, and Passchendaele kind of sunk cost fallacy. It went on too long. But if he's to blame for them, then surely he is to take the credit for the victories of 1918, and that all seems to be forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly if you kind of, the way you attribute something is going to stay consistent, then that has to be true. I mean, Passchendaele's not good. As working as someone who guides out there a lot and tries to kind of explain the point of it, they don't achieve their objectives. The cost is really, really high, and not at a great attritional rate where kind of the middle stage of the Somme campaign, some people say that's the worst. Those are the worst phases of the Somme campaign in terms of kind of ground gained versus casualties taken. If ground gained is your only metric for success, then that phase of the Somme campaign is really bad, and Passchendaele is very, very bad indeed. It's the successes are easier to distribute, I think, maybe is the thing. It's able to, especially when you get into 1918 and the Germans are tired. That tends to be the kind of, if you don't want to attribute success to Haig at all, it's easy to say, well, the Germans are knackered from 4.5 years of war nearly, and a big spring offensive. and fighting on two fronts for years. So of course they lost in the end. But
Ludendorff, didn't Ludendorff himself attribute, say about the Somme, it was the muddy grave of the German army or something?
I don't think it was Ludendorff. I think there was a German, yeah, I think there was a German staff officer who said it was the muddy grave of the field army. I said a lot of Germans killed on the Somme. The Battle of the Somme changes the First World War, actually. It changes the Germans' approach to things. And so I think it's sometimes telling to look at what your enemy does in the response of something to judge the effectiveness of it. The Somme, you can see a clear shift and change, whereas Passchendaele, there's a great picture out there somewhere which I've searched for. I think I've only seen it on one of Spencer Jones's slides, where he's got the British line tangled up in barbed wire there, and the Germans just see Passchendaele as this tremendous defensive victory, and that is tough to argue with, and the cost just doesn't compare to anything that the British can look at favourably, really. And Haig wears it more than Plumer does, more than Gough does, which is the key army commanders involved in it. Gough wears other things, maybe, but Haig really takes Passchendaele away, and doesn't necessarily take the successes. Like a few days after they closed the Passchendaele offensive down, they launch arguably the most creative assault of the entire war by any side, because the 20th of November, Cambrai opens, and that is terrifying. And that's another thing that kind of changes the Germans' mindset, because you see this assault, and the tanks steal the show with Cambrai. I get it, and so you can have your sort of individual officers, like tank officers, people like JFC Fuller chipping in on kind of their roles, and other people, Swinton, kind of their parts to play in things like this, and Byng gets some good news out of Cambrai briefly, I guess, and then not so much when the counter-attack comes in. But while tanks steal the show, there's also incredible developments in artillery techniques, and fusing the two together into something which ends up becoming the all-arms battle, which is almost irresistible in 1918. Actually, the British Army of 1918 is absolutely terrifying. And with imperial forces sort of fully merged into that, and technology, the peak of technology involved in it too. And if Haig was going to get credit for anything, it's got to be this transition from small colonial force to expanded, bloated army. That's what he gets hold of. Inexperienced troops, and then converting that into this all-arms machine of death that you get in 1918, with fantastic logistical capacity and the tooth to tail thing sorted, as well as incredible teeth. And I think that's poorly understood.
So maybe the case that Haig was a bit of a victim of circumstance, in that the Somme wasn't his first choice. It was to relieve the pressure on the French. Passchendaele, it was to relieve the pressure on the French. Again, they were a bit wobbly by then. Is that true?
I don't know. With the Somme, when they're making the plans at the end of 1915, they're trying to win the war. They've had the finance experts from the city coming in saying, "Do you have any idea how much this is costing? We need to win the war like soon. Can we go for it, please?" And so yeah, when the plans are put together in Chantilly with the French, and the Russians kind of on board, they're going to launch their big summer offensive as well. We're going to break the German army in 1916. Now, when the Germans attack Verdun, then that changes things and puts the British into the lead, which is a role they've not had, and certainly not on that scale before. So there's then a bit of sort of measurement of our chances of success. But when they're first planning it, it's not relieving the French, it's we're going to smash the Germans. With the spring offensives in 17, that's a cooperative effort with the French as well. I think you can maybe argue that the Battle of Arras goes on a bit too long, and into May, because the French are having their wobble, which I think is overstated. The French were still manning the lines, and they weren't, going to give up the ghost at that point. And maybe the British didn't quite understand that either. But the Battle of Arras is a bad one as far as casualties per day. That's actually worse than the Somme, worse than Passchendaele, worse than the 100 Days. It's the worst of the lot, in fact. And so That's not a good one. But the Flanders offensive of 17, that was the offensive that Haig wanted. It's also the one that Higher Command wanted. The naval chiefs, Jellicoe, sitting in meetings saying, look, we don't actually have a good answer to these German submarines that are sailing out of Zeebrugge, apart from other places. We kind of need you to clear the Flanders coast for us. And so Haig sees a real strategic win there, and the higher ups see a real strategic win there, but it's just such a congested battlefield that it's hard work. So relief for the French is part of the story a little bit, but they've got their own objectives too.
Right, okay. Bart, what is the Australians' thoughts about Haig? Is he Butcher Haig to the Australians now, or have they moved on? Have you moved on from butchers and bunglers? And you've got your own hero in Monash.
Yes. I mean, I guess it depends on whether you're talking about what was Haig to Australians during the war, and what is he to Australian historians now. And I think in some ways he's been a good foil for a different story about Australians, which is the story that developed that Australians had found something about themselves in the First World War, that it had revealed a national character, and that character involved I guess a sense that Australians were natural soldiers, that they'd excelled on the battlefield, and that you could project this image onto Australians more generally. And the idea that not just Haig, but that all British officers were somehow hidebound, that they'd been brought up institutionally, and that Australians, by contrast, had been drawn from civilian life, and they'd been conditioned by the environment out here to be adaptable and egalitarian. In fact, Haig and others work really well as the opposition to that idea, and someone like Monash sort of epitomizes that contrast. So Monash, comes from an engineering background in civil life. He's a civilian soldier. He's very interested in soldiering, but in terms of what he manages to do in the First World War, he rises up from a brigadier in 1914 to become corps commander, and all those things that Andy's just talked about in terms of the potency. I've lost your phrase already, but an incredible death machine. It's wonderful. Monash comes to be associated with that. He embraces the technology. He embraces the all arms integration. He has some real success with some set pieces in 1918, and so Australians, including Monash, to be fair, have loved to point to that and say, look, here's the embodiment of that learning. Although we don't tend to see it as learning, I guess popularly it's more, someone came from outside to show you all how it's done. And Monash, wrote this all up in 1920 and said, he wrote a book called The Australian Victories in France, in which he essentially said, well, it was all us, weren't we terrific? Interestingly enough, this looks like nothing more than Australian parochialism, and I'm very happy to wear that. But the British press was also very willing to get on board and to suggest that the Australians had turned out to be the best soldiers and perhaps even the best leaders in the First World War, and that had its roots in the idea that the empire had been made whole by this experience, and that the Dominions had come to join the party and become a genuinely organic British Empire. So there was some benefit to that narrative, but I am willing, of course, to hear the get off your high horse, Australians, and remember what you were just that little group. But if I'm going to wear the hat of the Australian parochial Australian, there's some figures that suggest a very good performance.
With Monash himself, very creative, independent thought, and do you attribute that to his background? And he didn't come through the British military system, the Sandhursts, and work his way up that, or would Monash have been Monash no matter what the system?
Gee, it's a good question.
Tricky one, but yeah.
I mean, look, he was quite an extraordinary person, and had interests all over the place. I mean, one of his interests was making vibrated concrete products before the war. Did that help? Maybe it did. I mean, certainly the mythology is that he was it was his outsiderness that made it possible for him to see things differently, to embrace conference style discussion with his subordinates. I know that's also true of his British leaders, but we like to point to that and say again, it's an egalitarian trait. But I can't really say whether it's one or the other in terms of whether he was always going to be so. We'll say yes,
you could,
because
you could probably have the same sort of discussion about curry and Canadians as well, I guess. Similar
Absolutely.
things. Yeah. Woody, you believe you've got a question from the audience?
Yeah, I think this is a really good one, because it's obviously we've got our resident Australian with us, and I'm living in France, but it's kind of been a bit British focused. So Joe Rooney said right at the beginning, so far you're only talking about the British Army. What about the French Army? Did the lions led by donkeys idea get applied to the French, or indeed the Germans, who we mustn't forget actually lost? I mean, if they have any right to kind of criticize, they came out of it really broken. So you've kind of touched on that with the panelists, but is it a uniquely British stroke empire thing? Well, that stumped you.
Yeah, the only parallel I can think of is it Mangan, who was christened Butcher. He was really christened Butcher, and he was a bit profligate with his men's life. Monash, yeah, sorry, it's my French pronunciation, as you can tell. Yeah, am I correct in saying he was a bit Butcher was maybe a bit fairly attributed to him?
Well, you get a few quotes from French journalists. Was he also whatever you do, you lose people?
Yes,
I think
that's it. Yes, and that never goes down well.
But the way they raise armies and the way they fight wars is different to how Britain does, or did anyway. You think of a time in history prior to the First World War where Britain has ever mass recruited from its civilian population and sent hundreds of thousands of men to go and fight and die on the continent. Never. Like Battle of Waterloo was 30% of the British Army, or British Army. The Allied army there is British. There's a lot of Germans on the battlefield, and the French have sort of started this culture of civilian enfranchisement and the demands of a sort of civilian soldiery. And Germany has national service in a way that Britain doesn't. France has the same, and so that's part of the reason they can call on such huge bodies of trained men straight away. But it's also put them in a fairly stoic mindset of, this is what we do. I think they're a bit more religious, actually, the Germans as well, but prior to the war, possibly. And so they enter the war with a slightly different mindset, whereas for the first time ever, and it's a very fair comment, they're sacrificed for they're invaded. They're invaded. Britain isn't, in the same way at all. So, the attitudes, I think, are different before we start, and then we have this mass raising of a civilian army for the first time ever, and the losses are on a scale that we've never experienced before or since. The First World War was our worst war by a country mile. I mean, in terms of loss of life, it's way worse than the Second World War, and so you get to the end of the thing, and the victory kind of hurrah, I think, doesn't last very long. Actually, you've got this incredibly profound sense of grief that the country goes through, and then the coping mechanism of the beautiful cemeteries get created, and the great thinkers and architects, and chip into it. And so I think there's a really different mindset between the British and the continental powers with their experience of war. if that helps.
It does.
Yes, yeah. Jonny, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, it's kind of coming on to the business of commemoration and the idea of a lost generation. It's just, as far as I'm aware, it's the first time ordinary soldiers are properly commemorated. I think it's the post Franco-Prussian War, the Treaty of Frankfurt, basically says you have to permanently commemorate dead soldiers. You know, we're probably all not sitting very far away from a war memorial, which has the names of probably a fair number of people from your town who died in the conflict. It's an event we remember every year as well. That's the other thing, you know. It recurs every year, and this comes back now. For me, whether the myths during those sort of periods of commemoration, there's not a great deal of time to talk about it in terms of the media and so on, but I don't feel like the myths are challenged enough. I think there was probably a great opportunity during the centenary to do so, and I think some of them did. Or some of them were challenged, but probably not well enough. So yeah, I think we've probably moved forward. This is sort of a very roundabout way of trying to sort of move on to another question, because I'm not very good on the French. But yeah, it feels like we've moved forward a little bit in terms of commemoration. I'm really interested to hear what Bart, because I know it's his specialist subject, hear what Bart says about commemoration. But yeah, I think it's just the very nature of the way the war is commemorated, the men are commemorated, is obviously a very different thing, and has pervaded for over a century.
There's also the idea that it was a whole generation lost. Where do you sort of stand on that idea, Bart?
Yeah. Well, just in response there to the question of commemoration, I mean, I guess that the big thing about the First World War is that citizens are called on to buy into the national cause. They're drawn out of, especially in Britain and its empire, where there's not a long tradition of conscription. You're calling on the citizens to put down tools and join the army, and so there's a genuine quid pro quo here, in that if you're going to die for the nation, then you deserve that individual recognition. It's just not going to cut the mustard to do what has been done in previous wars in terms of mass graves, you know, memorials that might only mention the officers or indeed the generals. So, you know, if we think of this as a war of mass societies, and it's true on the continent as well, that even though they have those traditions of conscription, they are calling citizens to join in with this, and there's got to be some recognition of what they've been asked to do for the nation. On the lost generation, I mean, there's two ways to look at this, isn't there? I mean, one is on the numbers, and you know, the demographic work was done by the likes of Jay Windsor back in the 80s and 90s, which on the numbers says, well, this doesn't work. You know, and especially the myths of all the women who never could marry. The demographic recovery is actually reasonably quick, and you've got quite a bit of inward migration into the UK that can cover for this. But that's the numbers side of it. The other side of it is the people side of it, and it's really a middle class myth, this one, in terms of that it was born from the sense that a particularly gifted generation had been prevented from reaching its potential, and that's if you want the ballast for that myth, it doesn't come from the numbers, it comes from the particularities. You know, you think of Vera Brittain makes Roland Leighton the cause célèbre for this. You know, what's lost there? The poets, Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen. Raymond Asquith, the Prime Minister's son, is lost. Rudyard Kipling's son, I saw in the commentary there, we're reminded that he lost his son Jack in 1915. And all of these stories come to us through through the writing of people who can get that story out there and make us, when we read Vera Brittain, really think to ourselves, well, you know, gee, something really was lost here. But again, in demographic terms, it's a different story there. But that's, you know, nobody points to demography when we're talking about myths.
And there's also the PALS battalions, which meant people who worked together, lived in the same area, all served together. If they were all in the same place during a particularly bloody attack, then that's the entire, you know, male population of that village, that town, whatever, which probably amplifies the sort of the sorrow, if you like, and the.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you think about, how does this war come to people? How do they get a sensibility about the scale of it? And it's through things like casualty lists. It's through the experience of knowing who is in mourning down the road. It's hard, you know, I mean, we can get onto the newspapers, but it's hard to get a sense of scale, except perhaps through the casualty lists in terms of what's going on. But if you're seeing it in your street, and this takes us back to a point that Andy made earlier about the Somme and how it changes things. It doesn't just change things on the battlefields, of course, it changes things in people's psychology, you know. And they certainly in Australia, you can see it, that at the start of the Somme campaign, there's a very pronounced hope that this is going to be the end of the war. And over weeks, you can see that psychology changing very significantly to the point where people are readjusting their idea about what the measure of success can be. And it does start to get measured in actual meters gained or yards gained and that sort of thing. So if you're measuring that against the lists that are coming in and what you're seeing in your own streets, then yeah, absolutely, you can see what fuels that idea that a whole generation is lost.
And there's also this idea that you've got the generals who had this cushy life sitting in their chateaus, and poor old Tommy is sitting in the same trench for 4 years in the mud, getting shot at. So that is another sort of enduring image. Lockie, what's your thoughts on that?
Blackadder's got a lot to answer for, isn't it?
It does, yes.
I mean, I think this is actually one of the easier ones to sort of knock away in terms of the lifestyle things and command how it had to work, because the number of brigadiers that get killed in 1915 is a fairly stunning number. I think it's 73 generals in total in the course of the war, but a large portion of that is in the first sort of year of the conflict for the British, because they think, oh, we're gonna lead our men, we're gonna lead our brigade. No, terrible idea, and you lose that expertise. And so the closer you get to the action, the fewer men that you can command, and communication practicalities dictate that. If you are in a shell hole with some lads, you can command those lads only. And so there's not actually very much point. Lifting soldierly skill and empowering and educating and training the junior officers becomes such a crucial thing, and then devolving firepower down to the infantry to be able to fix their own problems and not require a general next to them. That becomes the gig, and by the middle of 1917, actually, BEF's quite good at that. But the process to get there is really, really tough. Chateau generals, yeah, where do you need your army commander? You know, he might have 300,000 men under his command. Where does he need to be? He needs to be somewhere probably outside of artillery range, so that sticks him a couple of miles to the rear, with phone lines connecting him to reserve formations, artillery formations, particularly heavy artillery. He needs to be able to direct things. He also needs to be able to report to his army group commander what's going on, because if resources need to be shifted, then they can give the orders there. He needs to be connected to his entire front, and he cannot be that in the front line. So it's a fairly simple thing regarding the life in the trenches. Yeah, it sucked. What do you want? The life in the trench, it was really hard, especially when it got, funnily enough, you're going to go through diaries and things. Actually, when it was freezing cold, that wasn't so bad because the ground goes firm and you can sort of, all right, you're chilly, but you can sort of stomp your feet and keep yourself going. You wouldn't be in the front line for more than, you know, if you move in one night, you're going to have the full day, you're going to have another night, you're going to have another full day, and then you get relieved on the following night. So it's sort of 2 full days in the trenches, in the front line trenches. Then you'll be out into a support position, then in a reserve position, and then you'll rotate, your battalion will rotate and come into divisional reserve, brigade reserve, whatever. So at any given time, you can have a couple of days, then you'll circle out another couple of days, and then you'll be in the reserve areas. It's not just sitting there for 4 years. Right, one thing about Blackadder. No one looks at the second season when he's in the Elizabethan court and says this is a realistic, gritty portrayal of life in the Tudor period. No one looks at the Georgian kind of Regency thing and says, "Oh, this is what it's like in the court of the Prince Regent." Why is it this one? And we have to kick against it. But yeah, the practical matters were tough for the soldiers. They really were tough. That's you know, can't get away from it. But also the command challenges didn't really dictate any other course of action.
And it would actually be almost irresponsible for a general to get himself shot and put out of that, because that leaves your vacuum there. It's, you know, that's the people won't know what to do until they get the next person in charge. Or yeah. And also for the Tommies in the trenches, then would their dissatisfaction, any dissatisfaction they have, it's unlikely to be so much with, say, Haig as opposed to their immediate superior. Generally at work, your gripes tend to be with your more immediate supervisors rather than the person at top. I've worked for 4 or 5 different local authorities. I've never met the CEO in any of them. You know, would that be the case for your general Tommy? His sort of day-to-day dissatisfactions, things like his immediate boss, whether the food's hot, whether he's getting clean boots, or, you know, that kind of thing.
I wonder though if I mean, I think you're right to point to things like, is the food hot, and you know, am I keeping warm, and that sort of thing. And I guess your immediate superiors can share in that complaint, and you can refer that one up the line. I mean, certainly, you know, one of the great insights we get as far as Australians go in terms of their experience is that they got a vote in 1916 and in 1917, in fact, on whether to impose conscription back home in Australia. And interestingly enough, the soldiers in the front line voted against it. And one of the things you find there is that the reasons they're voting against it are not about the principles of conscription so much, but it's about their circumstances. It's about, they've just come out of the Somme, the winter's coming on, it's cold, they feel like they haven't been treated well, they feel like they've been pushed too hard, and finally they've got an opportunity to kick against that. And so I think they do have in mind that there are people above them who have control of what they do and how well they're treated. And what they tell their superiors is, you haven't treated us especially well, at least as far as they were concerned. I'm not sure, you know, they reflected on their peers in other armies as nicely as they might have, but that certainly there was an opportunity to refer their complaints upwards, and they certainly took it.
And so, I mean, would you say that the war poets that everybody is so familiar with, do they speak for your average Tommy, Jonny?
It's a fairly unequivocal no from me. I'm sort of quite intrigued by it. The poets thing passed me by a little bit, if the truth be told. There's an awful lot of death, pity, and horror, and none of them actually ever really seem to point out that they are actually there to kill people. The anti-war works, I mean, it's sort of well established, and I think it just Bart touched on this. It kind of gets picked up by this sort of the 1960s literary elite who think this is sort of a really authentic view of how the war was. Does it reflect the views of the average Tommy? I think he's probably more concerned about where his next rum ration's coming from, isn't he, than this. It just strikes me as a sort of quite a niche thing. And I was doing a bit of digging around because it's not a subject I know a huge amount about. But I came across the facts. I'd love to know if it's actually true. A quarter of poems published during the Great War were by women, compared to a fifth written by soldiers. Now, I think that's quite telling in the sense that we have heard very, very little from female poets or about female poets in the Great War. I just picked up on one, Evelyn Underhill, who wrote in her poem "Non-Combatants," never of us be said we had no war to wage. So yeah, poets, fine. Do they reflect the views of the average Tommy? Probably not. But yeah, it certainly has a valid place within the study. But let's maybe have a little bit more variety
and they're not all anti-war either. You've got the John McCrae, the famous one in Flanders Fields, the line, "Take up our quarrel with the foe." That's not let's stop this war by any stretch.
No, very true. Very true. Yeah, I think I probably focus in on it's this sort of slightly flowery anti-war stuff, but that pervades, I think, more than anything else. You're absolutely right. It's certainly not the only viewpoint, but that's, to me, seems to be what pervades over all else.
I think Woody's got a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, questions and comments about Haig. And I think the first one from Ian T is saying casualties in 100 days are pretty bad, but ground gained and less said about that. Haig, not my favourite, but by 1918, British and Commonwealth armies probably the best soldiers in the world, which was what Lockie was saying earlier on. And I think as a World War II student, you have to look at why the hell in 1940 couldn't we have adopted at least some of the professionalism of the 1918 army and kind of repeat it again? We had to learn the same lesson again. And then Sal, from what's going on with shipping, saying, well, this is a big two. We're not going to answer this one. It's a rabbit hole that we can't. It's a rabbit warren, this one. How does Haig rank against the likes of Joffre, Neville, Petain, Pershing, Brusilov, and all the other Allied commanders? Is he really that bad as no one had commanded multiple British armies? And I think that multiple British armies point, I think you all touched on earlier, is really interesting because, I'm in the coming to the end of the Market Garden series of shows on World War II TV, and we're talking about armies created in the summer of 44 that had never existed before. The British did not have paratroopers in 1940. By 44, they've got an army of them, and knowing what to do with them, the only way of learning it is by doing it. And I think, from my limited understanding of the First World War, is that the size of forces wielded by that 1917, 1918 period, Haig's got to learn it all on the go. There's no previous about dealing with something that large of a combined force. Am I kind of right on that, Andy and Jonny and Bart?
Yeah, absolutely, completely. Go on, Jonny.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to a point that Andy's made, and I think it's a hugely pertinent one. To go from where the British Army was, or the BEF was in 1914, to where it was in 1918. In terms of size and dealing with all of those things, logistics, how you train, how you sign these men up, how you train them, how you equip them, how you feed them, how you move them about, how you teach them to fight. Doing that in peacetime would be an extraordinary achievement in that space of time. Doing it while you're fighting a war that is absolutely unprecedented in scale is just an extraordinary feat. And I think that's missed. I think that still, for me, just gets missed an awful lot. And it is one of those things where, and it's probably a separate debate. I was having a chat with Peter Hart the other night about Haig, and we were chatting with a guy who's not a particular fan. And the question was, would it actually have been a better chief of staff? Interesting question. One, another one to go down. But yeah, I just think it's if you're going to put the debits of the Somme and Passchendaele against him, you really have to look at the credits as well, which I just don't think he's done enough. Certainly not in more popular history. Obviously, we're doing it in academic history. That's fine, but in popular history, it really needs more oomph behind it, I think, for me.
It's funny to think
add in about sorry, Andy, about the Haig thing is that I want to ask you, as First World War academics and historians, do people's minds change about their favorite commander? Because at 1,500 shows in on World War II TV, the MacArthur lovers still love him, the MacArthur haters still hate him, and the same applies to Patton and Montgomery and all the other guys. And you pretty much will not shift anyone's views. No matter how many counter arguments come in, people are absolutely entrenched in their views on these people. Does the same thing more or less apply to your war?
I like the use of entrenched in that sense.
Yeah, I know. I chose that pun deliberately. I mean, I've done a few of these. I know how to throw in appropriate puns.
I think there's also the question, though, if you got rid of Haig, who would have took his place?
Well,
Was there anyone?
Monash.
No.
Monash. But yeah, who realistically could have taken his place at that point in time?
That would have been a meteoric promotion, wouldn't it? From brigade commander, divisional commander, short spell, corps commander, bang, commander in chief, army group commander. Wow.
So I was willing to be a strong man there.
Eisenhower did it in World War II. I mean, he went from colonel to 5-star in 2.5 years. So I mean, you know, it's a precedent was set 20 years later. But you know, it's interesting just as a non-student of this war that there's so many parallels in World War II, which is basically what we try to do with these channels. Remind our viewers that the two wars have a lot of the same issues, the same debates, just 20 years apart. But Louise, I think you want to take it kind of more to commemoration and historiography and where are we?
Yeah, where are we? You know, you had the initial Little Heart and David Lloyd George and Oh What a Lovely War, and then we've got Gary Sheffield as completely the other side, who's very his Forgotten Victory puts across debunks a lot of the myths and perpetuating beliefs. Where is it now? Because I know Spencer Jones isn't quite on the same level as Gary in terms of, you know, he has his criticisms of Haig. So where is academia at the moment with it?
Oh, I think the pendulum has maybe swung as almost as far as it's going to go just at the moment. I don't think you're going to have too many banging the drums saying that Haig was the greatest thing since sliced bread, because, you know, I think just passioned out sticks there. And that's difficult to push past. My hope is that, yeah, I mean, the comparisons with some of the German generals actually are maybe valid, and I like the idea of him as a chief of staff. And in a German army, he probably would be, but you probably have Kitchener as the sort of figurehead in that sense, and Haig below him working away, actually pulling the strings, really. I don't know of too many who are actively banging the pendulum swing further towards the Haig is brilliant side at the moment. Jonny?
No, to be honest, I think you mentioned this to Louise and I when we were looking about, you know, stuff to talk about. World War II TV, really, you'll be looking at, you know, something niche to do with Arnhem or whatever, and we're still arguing over the commander-in-chief. Now, is it really time to sort of to stop scratching the scab? Is the question, and just try and move people on to the wider subject. Again, you come back to the casualties. You come back to the reasons why it's pervaded for so long. It's incredibly difficult to do. I do think you're right. I do think we've probably gone as far as you're going to go. In terms of persuading people, Woody, I think you're right. It actually changing people's minds is incredibly difficult. And I think once people get entrenched, pun intended, it takes an awful lot to move them. I think where for me, it's important to try and sort of kick back is unfortunately a huge amount of this plays out on social media, and it's just trying to persuade people that clearly haven't read a book written in the last 30 or 40 years on the subject, trying to, you know, maybe it's futile, another great F word, you know, associated with the Great War. Maybe it's futile trying to sort of move them towards actually kind of looking at the literature. We do try, and quite frequently get frustrated with it. But yeah, is Haig a scab we've got to stop scratching, for want of a better phrase?
Because even with Second World War films, we've got obviously Arnhem, Bridge Too Far, we've got your Achilles Heroes, your Eagles Dare. It's gung-ho, it's fun, it's adventure, whereas everything that's the First World War ones I've seen is basically, well, for want of a better word, misery porn. You know, there's nothing, there's no camaraderie, it's just a load of guys getting shot. That's it. There's no story behind it. So, and that doesn't help to change the public perception. I don't know, are there any specific Australian shows other than the well-known ones, the ones that maybe ones that we wouldn't know about?
Oh, in popular culture.
Yeah. And Gallipolis, obviously, we all know about that film.
Yeah.
Anzacs, yeah.
Probably not. I mean, and if there are, they're in that same vein. I guess there was one. It was called Beneath Hill 60, which is about Messine. But which I guess it was good in the sense that the literature on the experience of soldiers in the First World War academically has pushed beyond the war and into to questions of post-war life and the effects of war on people. And for a long time, the key myths in Australia suggested that the typical soldier was bronzed and tough and wasn't psychologically affected by war, and that has turned actually in popular culture, and we do get a lot more representation of the difficulties that people had, which I suppose, given what you've just said, Louise, might be just a sign that we're gravitating towards that sort of wallowing. I mean, there's been already a reaction in the academic literature against it, to say, well, hang on a minute, we have to remember some people got on with their lives. Some people managed to put together quite successful lives after their war service. So there's some funny interactions between myths here that we have, in Australia, between sort of seeing the First World War as this terrible exercise in futility, and on the other hand, seeing it as a moment of sort of national awakening and actually having some genuine worth in how we think about ourselves. So we pick and choose a bit, and our cultural products pick and choose a bit as well in terms of how to represent the First World War. But no, I'll go out on a limb and say that since Gallipoli, we haven't produced anything really provocative in terms of asking people who see this in the mass to think differently about the First World War. And I guess it's in the nature of myths, and we do have to look to those products. And some of the stuff coming out, even I mean, I don't want to get into the latest All Quiet on the Western Front, but it's
let's not
down that path.
But I want to I know, again, I'm going to let back to Louise in a minute, but just kind of begin to wrap things up. What would you like to be talking about? If the Lions led by donkeys thing is, it's swung as far as it's going to go, as Lockie and Jonny have said, what should, and I don't mean necessarily at an academic level. I mean, if there's a conversation going on in a pub, and it's about Haig being a butcher and the Lions, what should be people in the pub be talking about? I mean, in World War II, we've got lots of them. We've got Market Garden, we've got, Code Breaking Ultra, we've got, Leadership, Montgomery, MacArthur, Nimitz. What should be the conversation that your average kind of part-time war buff is talking about with their mates in the pub? Give me some ideas of what the subjects you'd like to be discussed.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah,
and I would say that it was 4 years of amazing technical innovation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we started off on a flat plane with cavalry charges. By the end of it, you've all arms warfare with tanks. You've got oil-fired battleships. You've got aeroplanes. I mean, that is just awesome in the space of 4 years. And contrary to popular opinion, again, another myth, Haig wasn't anti-technology. He promoted it.
Okay, that's Louise's vote.
That's just my thoughts anyway.
I think there's any number of things. I mean, looking at sort of individual battles, I mean, as Lockie noted, Cambrai is just the most extraordinary thing. And again, you know, there's not a huge amount of historiography on it. It's been written about, but I think that there's more to be done. Yeah, the technology I think is extraordinary, and just in terms of the development, the way this always sticks with me, and I can't actually remember who told me it, but the way I had it explained to me was if you put Wellington and Napoleon on somewhere around Ypres in 1914, they sort of broadly recognised what was happening. You move it to 1918, they wouldn't. But if you took a battlefield general from 1918 and stuck him in the middle of Ukraine now, he'd understand it. Yes, obviously the technology is very different, but that's how much it advanced. You know, that's how much it changed, which I think is, you know, as you say, is an extraordinary thing, and there's not enough concentration on that at all in terms of the, you know, the advances, you know, literally, you know, even at the very, very basic level, just how things evolved, how obviously you have the use of gas and how gas masks involve protection against that, going from literally kind of a cloth covered in urine over your face to the smallpox respirator, which was produced in its millions within, you know, a very short space of time. It's things like that which I think, and whenever I go out to the battlefields, I've been out with a couple of groups in the last 6 months or so. I haven't been before. When you talk about stuff like that, they react to it. It's like, well, I just didn't realise this. You know, again, you know, you think all we've got is a group, you know, a huge swathe of the population sitting there thinking, oh, you know, well, they were all in trenches for 4 years. They climbed out occasionally, got gunned down with machine guns, and eventually it finished. And it's kind of, well, there's an awful lot more to it than that.
I'd continue with what Jonny is hitting on. It's the last year of the war, I think, for me. If I could get people talking about, or just even thinking about what the last year of the war looked like, because how long was the war? 4 years, 5 years of fighting. Okay, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918, and they all look different. And so that last year, like November 1917 through to November 1918, you've got such a different look from even a year and a half previous. So getting people to understand how the Germans experienced Cambrai, they put a counterattack together, which is staggering, and the British didn't think they had that in them. But the idea that they could be attacked, when I say sort of school kids out, I try and explain the Battle of Cambrai. The way I try and do it is like, imagine you're a German soldier in a quiet sector of the line. Okay, not just a quiet sector of the line, a quiet sector of the Hindenburg line. You know, this terrifying defensive fortification, which has stopped attacks and got belts of barbed wire, dozens, hundreds of yards thick in front of you, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, without any pre-ranging, an accurate bombardment drops on your front line trench. Where the hell has that come from? Bam, 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 bam. Well, okay, but they can't be attacking now because all our barbed wire's still out in front. And then all of a sudden, 350 tanks come sort of steaming towards you and start ripping and dragging the barbed wire out of the way. And then what that does to the German high command, that leaves them thinking, holy God, we can't sit back and let that happen to us again. We're going to have to go out and get on the offensive. And that then changed. 1918 it's exciting, it's dynamic, it's the sides really going for it, and all the kind of films that we watch about sort of 1944, 45, when you've got the sort of the strongest armies in the world going for it against each other, that we consider dynamic and entertaining. Where's my movie about 1918? You know, that would be my thing, really. If I've got one other one, I'd say, do you know what? Most of the soldiers got on with their jobs and complained a lot. That would be the other one.
There's also some people, you know, it depended on what sectors you're in, where you were posted. There's this sort of almost homogenous view of the Tommy in the trench, getting wet, getting shot at, getting killed. People are in different sectors, quiet sectors, different places. Some people, there are accounts where people have said they even enjoyed their war. Okay, one of them was Adrian Carton de Veil, who was bonkers, but I mean, there are other accounts that I have read, so not everyone had the same experience, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point in terms of the for want of a better phrase, the Tony Ashworth book, which is a really interesting tone. There's faults with it, but the live and let live thing, yeah, there are sectors where you're 300 yards away from the enemy, and it's kind of like, do we really have to shoot at each other? Is this worth it? And you just get that sort of, kind of static non-warfare, for want of a better phrase. Yeah, there's an awful lot to be said for looking at things like that. Again, not widely studied. What was the average Tommy doing when he was, you weren't stuck in the middle of a major battle? There's trench raiding, there's sniping, there's patrolling, there's all sorts of things going on away from the major battles, which again, interesting subjects that again are not really widely touched upon.
And a lot going on in other areas of the world where you're more likely to die from a nasty disease than you are actually from the enemy fire as well.
Yeah, I guess I'd make an appeal. I don't think you can make a very good movie out of this, but I guess I'd make an appeal for understanding the war in the context of civilians and soldiers being in the same world of war. And I guess in the same way that one can look at the Blitz and say, well, civilians are part of this. We can see them being part of this. It's true in the First World War too. I mean, this thing can't go for 4.5 to 5 years without civilians buying into it. And the big question for mine at the pub would be, well, how did people keep going all that time? What made them keep going? And it's a great thing for piercing myths. We heard this earlier that these things are lodged in time, and if we can get our heads around, or at least have a discussion about why people committed to this thing and kept committing to it in the face of those casualties, I think that's the thing that's worth trying to wrap our heads around at the pub is why didn't they just give up? What was it about this war that they thought was so worth fighting for, that they would sustain these terrible sacrifices that just hadn't been seen on a scale like this before?
Well, this actually was another one of my myths, but Woody's giving me that look. Will you wrap it up, please?
No,
But
I'm not. No, well, a little bit.
It was,
I wanted to just come back to all of you to look on some positives as well, Louise, because I try and do that on the panel discussions of World War II TV, and that us more or less 5 old fogies there. Blackadder is coming up for 40 years old now, so I'm assuming a lot of the school kids, Lockie and the others, take out. They have no idea what the hell you're talking about. So is there hope that the next generation won't be burdened with, they don't recognize the Kitchener poster, they haven't seen Blackadder, they haven't grown up with that idea, so are they able to absorb a different reality than our generation because they don't have those preconceived ideas? Lockie, I think you do the most in terms of working with school groups. Is that the positive look to the youth?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, I've said for a few years now, I think the average 15-year-old is better informed on the First World War than the average 50-year-old. Right. And the way that the education has moved forward in banging through myths, a lot of them will still do like a short essay, side of paper, is the tag Butcher Haig justified, and there will be different arguments that they'll have kicked around in class, from overall victory to high casualties, and a few, if the teacher's well informed, then you'll do some stuff in between. The world is a bit tough at the moment as far as getting kids out on battlefield tours goes, for a number of reasons. Cost is, anyway, don't need that discussion, but on the whole, yes, I think education has moved forward quite a lot. The myths just aren't getting picked up. Kids they haven't watched Blackadder. We've got teachers now who are too young for Blackadder as well, which is a scary thought.
I was going to say that even the teachers. Bart, you were talking about the Anzacs and Gallipoli. Blackadder, I obviously made it to that part of the world, but do you echo, and Lockie, that there's the new generation are going to be a little bit less burdened?
By that, certainly. We're still fighting the good fight here against the idea that that a national identity should be attached to this experience, and that's problematic on a whole bunch of reasons that have got almost nothing to do with the First World War. But you know, it's our political leaders still can set the agenda very strongly. Cultural change is slow. But you know, we heard earlier we set aside days every year to focus on what does this war mean, and that, you know, we get a public holiday for Anzac Day here, and we're supposed to stop and listen. And it is our political leaders who are still harking back to these old stories. You know, it's getting to the point of being facile, to be honest, and that's really hard to combat.
I did think sort of the anniversary 1418 would have been, things would have started to change, but the overwhelming feeling I got was it was still, you know, futility of war, lions led by donkeys. I didn't feel that there was a seismic shift there at all, and that would have been the perfect opportunity. Yeah.
Well, we keep working at the coalface.
We'll
right?
keep working at it. Yes, I think that's it. So anyway, I think it's probably time we brought us to a close, and thank you all again, and Bart especially for getting up at horrible o'clock to
It's
join
less
us.
early now, to be fair. It's less early now.
Less early now.
Well, the sun has come up
early
in the time we've been talking. So there you go.
But that's been great. Thank you very, very much for your time. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. And again, it's been you've just opened up more questions than you have in some ways answered questions, which is always the best kind of panel discussion. You kind of throw an idea around and realize it opens up more questions. But it's been a really satisfying chat from my point of view, and I think the viewers have enjoyed it. So thank you for everybody for your questions. We can't get to all of them. We'll announce something in the future. Well, this won't be World War One TV, as there's life in the old dog yet. We'll try and push things on, and in the meantime, World War Two TV, we've got John McManus on tomorrow talking about Operation Dragoon in the south of France. So come back to the mother channel for that. But in the meantime, it's been great hosting the four of you on this. So folks, we'll see you all again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.